Comencem, doncs, després d'aquesta obertura a les jornades.
Let's continue then with our session
Doncs amb un amic i
with a friend and great colleague.
que estem molt contents que hagi
We're very happy that he's been able to be here with us and that it's gonna bring a new perspective, which is the literary creation and literature. If you don't know him, Keith Lowe is the author of several books on the Second World War. In 2007, he published Inferno on the bombings of Hamburg during the Second World War, starting in 1943 mainly. And Hamburg, because it has many canals, the bunkers, I don't know if you have seen them, the shelters and bunkers are big concrete structures. And there is housing in there and sculptures. And we're gonna talk about that too during these sessions. In 2012, he published Savage Continent, which was about Europe after the Second World War. And recently he has published Prisoners of History, in which he reflects on bombings in the UK, Germany, and also monuments to the war. Maybe the next book could be about the avatars in the south of Europe and Mediterranean art. His books have been translated into more than 20 languages, and we have invited him for the keynote speech and to listen to his very interesting reflections. As he is someone who is a big communicator. We met in the Liberation Route Europe in Florence 2 weeks ago, and he was talking about the importance of these memory spaces during the Second World War and the importance for our current society, not only from a tourist point of view, but the importance of reclaiming, of getting back these spaces.
Welcome.
Thank you very much, Jordi. Okay, so Second World War. Well, I'll begin a bit earlier than that. It's a rule of human nature, I think, that as soon as we discover a new technology, the first thing we do is work out how to use it to kill one another. At the beginning of the 20th century, when the world was still quite excited about the invention of aeroplanes, the British science fiction novelist H.G. Wells wrote a book about how aeroplanes would be used to wage war. His novel tells the story of, strangely, a German attack on America, which sort of degenerates into a global conflict. But some of his descriptions are actually quite chilling. For example, here's his description of the bombing of New York in his book. He says, "They smashed up the city as a child will shatter its cities of brick and card. Below they left ruins and blazing conflagrations and heaped and scattered dead. Lower New York was soon a furnace of crimson flames from which there was no escape." Now that was written in 1908, and it's worth remembering that quote because basically this is what happened to large parts of Europe 35 years later. Now when H.G. Wells was writing, of course nobody had dropped any bombs from an aeroplane at that point. That didn't happen until 1911 when the Italians bombed Ottoman troops in North Africa. But of course, the effects of that were nothing like what H.G. Wells described. You know, the technology was still far too primitive. Even during the First World War, there was no such thing as large-scale bombing. The British pioneered the practice of flying beyond the front lines to bomb German railway junctions, German airfields, and so on. But actually their success was pretty limited. And the Germans also, they flew Zeppelins and aeroplanes across the sea to London, to bomb London. But their bombs usually caused more noise than damage and didn't really make any difference to the war itself. Nevertheless, military theorists everywhere recognized that this was a revolution. Why concentrate all your efforts on the battlefield when aeroplanes could jump over the battlefield and destroy the supply lines behind it? In fact, why bother with an army at all when you can completely bypass any army with aeroplanes? After the First World War, military theorists everywhere became very excited by this potential of bombing as a weapon. Here are three of the most influential people of the 1920s. There's actually some major differences between the way each of these men thought, but suffice it to say, by the 1930s, their thinking had more or less coalesced into a generally accepted theory of bombing. I won't go into them in detail because we haven't got time. Now, the most important part of this theory of strategic bombing is the downgrading of the battlefield. Now, for the first time in history, you can bypass the battlefield. You can fly straight to the center of any enemy nation, to their factories, their cities, their parliaments, and you can attack them right at their very heart. The physical aspects of this are very obvious. You can use bombing to destroy your enemy's infrastructure, but there's also a very important kind of spiritual or psychological level to all of this, because bombing is so precise, so violent, so overwhelming, it can be used to destroy your enemy's morale. It can be used to shock them into submission. This is what the Americans called shock and awe during the Iraq War. They dressed it up as if it was something new, but it's a very old idea. According to this idea, bombing has become kind of the ultimate weapon. It can win wars all on its own, according to this theory. Because when your enemy knows that you can strike them anytime, anywhere, why would they carry on fighting? Now, of course, this theory worked on a small scale when it came to fighting rebellions in the British Empire or in Libya or Ethiopia, if you're Italian. But the first time it's going to be tested in Europe on a large scale was during the Spanish Civil War. You're going to be hearing much more about that from people who know more about it than me, so I won't say any more about that now. Instead, I'm going to talk to you about the Second World War, which was really where bombing finally became the weapon that all the theorists and the science fiction novelists dreamed that it would be. The Second World War began with a promise by all sides not to bomb civilians. Right at the beginning of the war, President Roosevelt appealed to both sides to renounce the indiscriminate bombardment of civilian populations, and both the British and the Germans ostensibly agreed. But of course, this promise was almost immediately broken. When the Germans attacked Warsaw in 1939, they bombed it indiscriminately as a way of shocking and awing the Poles into giving up. In 1940, they did the same thing in the Netherlands, especially Rotterdam. Rotterdam's actually quite an interesting case because when the German troops arrived there, they issued an ultimatum to the defending forces. They basically said, "Give up now or we will bomb your city." And this is exactly what soldiers did during medieval times. It's Genghis Khan, but with modern technology. Now, the British also promised not to act like this. They actually began the war by attempting to bomb only very specific targets and avoid hitting civilians. The problem was that they weren't very good at it, because in order to hit a specific target, you have to be able to see it, of course. That means flying by day in a big, slow plane full of bombs. And it also means taking your time over the target. As a consequence, they were very easy to shoot down. In the first few months of the war, British bomber forces were decimated by the German defences. So in the end, they stopped bombing by day, as you would, and they began bombing by night instead. Now they couldn't see their targets, and as a consequence, their accuracy was absolutely appalling. Actually, the RAF conducted a report in 1941 into their accuracy, and they discovered that only a third of the bombs that they dropped actually hit within 5 miles of the target they were supposed to be aiming at. So that's how bad the accuracy was. As a consequence, in 1942, they gave up trying to bomb any specific targets at all. They just bombed whole cities, hospitals, factories, houses, everything. They just bombed everything. It was easier, simpler, more efficient. Meanwhile, the Americans joined the war. When they arrived in 1942 in Europe, they started just like the British did. They had high ideals about not bombing civilians. And unlike the British, actually, throughout the war, they continued to bomb in daylight so that they could see their targets properly. But the reality of it was that by 1945, their accuracy was not much better than that of the British. This is partly because of the weather. What's possible in the clear blue skies of California is not so possible over the cloudy skies in Germany, for example. It's also partly because of a very human emotion, fear. It's very hard to be accurate when your hands are shaking because Messerschmitts are attacking you on every side and flak is coming up from underneath. So, American crews became a bit notorious, really, for dropping their bombs too early before they quite got to the target so that they could get out of there as quickly as possible. So you see, in the end, more or less, we all bombed fairly indiscriminately during the war. British, Americans, Germans, all of us. And we justified it to ourselves with the hope that at least we were shortening the war. I do want to stress that the intentions were kind of good behind here. Military men aren't always monsters. They genuinely thought that their bombing would end the war early. And of course, if you end the war early, you're actually saving lives. But this is not how it looked to people on the ground. So I want to turn now to those people because, the whole theory of bombing, particularly the British theory, depends on how civilians will react to bombing. Can we destroy their morale? Can we shock and awe them into giving up? Now, to explore this, I want to talk about a single bombing operation, the one that I know best, the bombing of Hamburg in the summer of 1943. Hundreds of cities were bombed all across Germany in the Second World War, but the reason I want to concentrate on Hamburg is that, this was the ultimate bombing event. This was the biggest, the most successful, and also the most horrific. What happened in Hamburg was what the British were trying to achieve in every German city that they bombed. So I want you for a moment to try and imagine that you are there in Hamburg in the summer of 1943. The war, still a long way off, really. It's almost 1,000 miles away out on the Russian front somewhere. Hamburg hasn't suffered much, really, from the war yet. For example, it hasn't really been bombed in the last year. And though the air raid sirens do go off very regularly, they don't really seem to mean very much these days. So this Saturday night in in the summer of 1943, when the air raid siren goes off, your first emotion is likely to be one of irritation. You know, you're tired, you're annoyed, you don't think anything's going to happen. All you want to do is go back to sleep. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that you get out of bed, you go to the air raid shelter. You don't bother hurrying because you don't really think anything's going to happen. In fact, you only really start to feel worried when you hear the drone of the aircraft up above you. And then suddenly the whole sky is lit up in what looks like green and red fireworks. These are what the Germans call the Tannenbaum, is what they call a Christmas tree, because they're so sort of breathtakingly pretty. But what they actually are, they're the target markers, which the lead aircraft drop so that all the aircraft which are coming afterwards have something to aim at. Well, now, for the first time, you're beginning to feel a little scared. So you bundle your way into the shelter and you find yourself a seat. This is what most air raid shelters in Hamburg look like. Geordie mentioned that there are one or two really big central shelters with 2-meter thick concrete walls. But most shelters actually aren't like that. They're smaller, they're community shelters, they're built in the basements of people's houses usually, or just underground. They're quite small. Now, I've come across hundreds of descriptions of what it was like sitting in air raid shelters like this in Hamburg during the bombing, and they are uniformly awful. Many people describe the sound of the bombs, which was deafening, and the feeling of the walls of the shelter swaying under the force of them. Inside the shelters, it's pure pandemonium. People are screaming, they're praying, children are crying. But what seems to magnify the terror of it all is the fact that very often the electricity generators gave out during an air raid. So this is all going on in darkness. One woman I came across described the physical feeling of what it was like to have a high explosive bomb fall nearby. She said that the really sickening thing was it wasn't the sound of it, it was the change in the air pressure, which seemed to sort of suckle the air out of her lungs while the walls are juddering around her. So imagine, if you can, what it's like sitting there in pitch darkness, surrounded by all this deafening noise while the whole shelter is shaking around you. What scares you most is the noise, the explosions. But actually, that's not the most dangerous thing that's happening here. Far more dangerous than the explosive bombs are the incendiaries. All bombing people, but the British in particular, who ran sort of experiments about this in the early 40s, discovered that what causes the most damage in any bombing raid is not the explosions, it's fire. The reason that they drop the explosives is not to blow up buildings, it's to blow out the windows and to knock holes into the roofs, which allows air in, and that helps the fires to spread more efficiently. So, while the explosives are important, it's the incendiaries that are the main weapon. During that week, over 1 million incendiaries were dropped on Hamburg alone. That's more than one for every man, woman, and child in the city. Now, of course, down in your shelter, you don't know this, but dozens of the things have just fallen on your apartment block, just as they have on all the apartment blocks for miles around. So, while all the explosions are going on, the incendiaries are quietly setting fire to everything. So you're sitting there, you're surrounded by pandemonium for about 45 minutes. But it seems much longer to you, of course, because you've lost all sense of time. But then at last, the shelter falls silent, and at this point you're probably feeling quite relieved. The raid is over and you've survived. But in reality, your problems are just beginning, because soon you can smell smoke It's coming from somewhere, you don't know where. And the bunker warden comes around with his torch and he tells you that the house is on fire and everybody's got to get out. So you all file over to the door to leave the building. And what happens next is kind of beyond imagination, really. When the people stepped out of their shelters on the night of 27th of July, they were confronted by a vision that can only be described as hellish. Here they saw for the first time that it's not just their house which is on fire, it's the whole street, and the next street, and the street after that. In fact, the fires were so huge that there was, just one of them, just one fire covered 4 square miles. That's a single fire, with lots of other fires dotted around them. Now, a fire which is that big doesn't just burn, it does a lot more than that. Heat, as we know, rises, and on that air, that night, there was so much hot air rising above the city so quickly that it sucks in more air from the surrounding areas, which blow in to fill the vacuum behind it. This new air brings new oxygen, which helps the fires to burn brighter and fiercer. So you end up with this sort of chain reaction where the fires are getting hotter and hotter and the winds are getting stronger and stronger until the whole city is like a furnace with a hurricane force wind blowing through it. So when people came out of their shelters, when you came out of your shelter, you didn't only have the fire to contend with, you also had these hurricane force winds, which are so strong that they can blow a grown man off his feet. There are plenty of testimonies of firemen who went to try and fight the blaze, who had to get down on their hands and knees and crawl against the force of this wind. Parents literally had children blown out of their arms and sucked into the fire. Trees, telegraph poles were toppled by the force of this wind. And of course, the wind is full of sparks. That's the whole point. That's how things get, the fire spreads. Some eyewitnesses actually described this as being like in a snowstorm, which set fire to their hair, to their clothes, to everything. So as they're running for cover, they have to continually put out their clothes to stop themselves from burning to death. It was a matter of pure luck whether you survived or not. The people who did survive were generally those who found their way to a big wide open space like a park, or who dived into the canals. But even here, they weren't safe because, of course, many of the canals had oil spilled onto them, so the surface of the water is burning just like everything else. And so we see H.G. Wells's description back in 1908 no longer seems like mere fiction. With hindsight, it feels a little bit like some kind of prophecy. 45,000 people died in Hamburg during that week alone. This is a picture taken by Eric Andres in the immediate aftermath of the bombing. Here's another. The city itself was, of course, utterly destroyed, especially the northeast of the city. Here's a picture of what Hamburg looked like just after the war. You can see it's nothing but empty shells of houses here. Almost 1 million people became refugees overnight in Hamburg that July. And of course, they took their stories with them as they fled to all other parts of Germany. For a moment, actually, it almost seemed as if the dreams of all the military theorists would come true. For a moment, it looked as if Germany might give up. But of course, as we know, Germany refused to give up. They carried on fighting for almost 2 years after this event, until... it's basically another picture of Hamburg, which just shows a landscape of rubble and ruins. It is of Hamburg, but it could have been of any city in Germany. Now, the problem is, how do you remember events like this? How is it possible for us today to remember this kind of horror without making ourselves mad with grief or with shame, actually? It's a really difficult question, especially in Britain, because, we British don't want to remember ourselves as monsters. We think of ourselves as the heroes of the war. Part of this is the fact that what we were fighting was such an image of evil. We defeated the Nazis, the Hitler, the perpetrators of the Holocaust. These are the monsters, and this was just our weapon to try and defeat them. So we can't really say that we're the monsters, but we can't really say that we're the heroes either, I don't think. But we want to. So instead, we just forget. We simply forget what we did. We pretend it never happened. If you ask any British person about the bombing of Germany in between 40 and 45, many people will remember Dresden. We will even apologize about Dresden. But that's the only concession we will make. Most people in Britain have never heard of the bombing of Hamburg, even though it was more than twice as bad as what happened in Dresden. Twice as destructive, and twice as destructive in terms of casualties as well. That's Dresden. Hamburg we don't remember. We forget about Lübeck and Rostock and Würzburg and Pforzheim and all the other 200 cities and towns that we destroyed. We have no concept of these things really in Britain. How we do remember the war, well, this is one example. This is a statue of the man who masterminded the bombing of German cities, Sir Arthur Harris, the head of RAF Bomber Command. This statue was raised in the 1990s, I think it was 1992, outside a church in central London. It kind of remembers Harris as a hero. At the time when this was unveiled, there were some quite strong protests by British people. His statue was daubed with red paint. There was graffiti sprayed on it, and so on. But actually, the protests very quickly faded away, and he continues to stand there, a hero outside this church, with no mention whatsoever of what he did to German cities. Here's another memorial in London. This one was actually built quite recently in 2012. It shows a typical British bomber crew as they would look when they returned from a mission. And they're standing inside this kind of classical building. It's almost like it's a temple, and they're the gods who are standing inside, waiting to be worshipped. On the wall, there is an inscription saying that more than 55,000 airmen were killed flying these missions. So, they're not only heroes, these guys, they're also victims. They're martyrs to the war. Now, I don't want to be too disparaging, because everything that this memorial says is true. These men were heroes. It took real courage to fly night after night in a plane, not knowing if you're going to ever make it back home again. They were also martyrs. 55,000, that's more officers died in bomber planes than officers who died in the trenches in the First World War. It was a huge sacrifice they were making. So all the things that this monument says are true. But just as important are the things that the monument does not say. There's no mention here of the 600,000 German civilians that they killed in places like Hamburg. There is no mention of the 75,000 French and Dutch and Belgian civilians that they also killed. These were people who, they're supposed to be our allies. We're supposed to be liberating them, not bombing them. But we bombed them too in order to win the war. Nobody in Britain remembers these things. Even historians forget that we bombed our allies during the war in the name of winning the war. And memorials like this, which could be an opportunity to remember such things, actually deliberately avoid remembering them. Now let's turn to the Germans. Well, how do they remember the tragedy that they suffered? Well, again, this is a really difficult question, because how can they imagine themselves as the victims of the war when they were the nation which began the war and in fact, specifically began the bombing war? If you look at the memorials in Hamburg, most of them are incredibly modest, really, I think. This is a memorial in the northeast of the city. This is the area of the city which is most destroyed by the fires. This memorial stands outside a shopping centre, but it doesn't take pride of place. It's right in the middle of the road, and the road is, it's 5 lanes of traffic on one side and 5 lanes of traffic on the other side. So, it's very different from the big, grandiose memorial that the British have to their bomber crews. It's kind of almost apologetic, really, in the middle of this road. You probably can't see the inscription properly there. Some of it's cut off, but it only mentions 370 dead in one of the shelters nearby, not the thousands of others who also died in this area. There's no condemnation here of the British airmen who killed them. Instead, actually, the condemnation is of fascism. The inscription also says, never again fascism and never again war. Now, if the British don't really remember what happened, and if the Germans can't allow themselves to remember what really happened either, what do we do instead? Well, the answer is that we institutionalize our forgetting. The solution we've come up with is really quite ingenious, I think. We follow H.G. Wells's imagination, and we imagine that the bombing war was like a kind of apocalypse. The Germans, as we probably all know, call 1945 Stunde Null, loosely translated into English as Year Zero. It's almost as if the whole of history before 1945 has been erased, and we're starting again from scratch, Year Zero. Internationally, we do something a little bit similar, actually. When we think back to the 20th century, we imagine the Second World War as a kind of rupture in the middle of that century. The world before 1945 was sort of destroyed and replaced with a new world. It's a very sort of comforting image of death and rebirth, like the apocalypse followed by the new Jerusalem, if you like. I don't think it's a coincidence that many of the monuments to the bombing war all around Europe are actually Christian monuments, with this sort of idea of death and resurrection built into them. All around Europe, for example, churches were destroyed by the bombing during the war. Many of them have been deliberately left as ruins. This is one in Hamburg, the Nikolaikirche. There's a permanent memorial here to the bombing, and there's a sort of information centre in the crypt. But what really strikes you is the ruin. It's the end of something. This is the sort of end of a civilization on display. Here's the equivalent in Berlin, the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church. Here we can see the old destroyed church standing right next to the new rebuilt church. So you've got the apocalypse and the resurrection standing side by side. This is the British version of the same thing, Coventry Cathedral. And once again, you can see the ruin of the old church standing there, and right next to it, the new, modern, caring world is represented by the new cathedral. Now, the emphasis of all these places is a very sort of Christian message of forgiveness, reconciliation, rebirth, resurrection. Coventry Cathedral, actually, has been instrumental in forging links with lots of places all around Europe which suffered the bombing and other horrific events during the war. It's created a sort of international network of forgiveness and reconciliation. And the emblem of this network is the cross of nails. This is a crucifix made from the medieval roof nails which were found in the ruins of Coventry Cathedral after the bombing had taken place. They found them in the rubble, polished them up, and made them into these crucifixes. So we've got Christianity and bombing combined in a single image. I just want to finish up by saying it's not only the Christian world that does this. I want to finish by saying something about Japan. In Hiroshima, the atomic bomb is kind of remembered in a very similar way. We can see ruins preserved, just like the old churches in Europe, to remind us of the apocalypse which took place here, the sort of ruins of the old civilization. In the museum nearby, we can also see clocks and watches that stopped at exactly the time when the bomb exploded. The image here is that even time itself was brought to an end by the bomb. Once again, 1945 is this rupture, a moment when everything came to an end and we had the opportunity to reset our clocks. All around these ruins in Hiroshima and the museum where these artifacts are displayed, all around there are new roads, there are new memorials celebrating the birth of a new world. And what's the main characteristic of this new world? Well, we only need to look at all the monuments that are in Hiroshima. Here's one of them. This is the Children's Peace Monument. There are dozens of others in the park outside the museum in Hiroshima. There is a peace cairn. There's a flame of peace. There's a peace bell. There is a peace clock tower. There's a pond of peace. The museum is called the Peace Memorial Museum, and the park is called the Peace Memorial Park. And if the message hasn't got through yet, the road which leads you to this sort of new paradise is called Peace Boulevard. There's no condemnation here of the Americans dropping the bomb, just as there was no condemnation of the RAF dropping the bomb in Hamburg. Quite the contrary, in fact. The bomb in the museum, in all the inscriptions and all the memorials, when it's referred to, it's almost as if it were a natural disaster, falling from the sky like an act of God. So the message is the same as it was in Germany. The old, bad world has been destroyed completely, and a new, peaceful world has been reborn. It's a kind of beautiful message, a noble message, probably a necessary message, but it's not history. This is how we've chosen to remember the bombing, because we can't really bring ourselves to remember the ugly, messy reality about what really happened. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Keith. Tenim temps per 5 comentaris molt breus.
We have time for a few brief comments, especially questions, but make them brief and splendid.
Something I'm sorry, my English is not. So I'm coming from Berlin, and I'm growing up in the GDR in East Berlin, and so I remember that we are always remembered this bombing during the war as some kind of Anglo-American force to break on us. So you see in the GDR in the East Germany, and that's part of the Cold War time now, the remembering on the wars, that is their war. It's an imperialistic war, has nothing to do with us. So and therefore it's very interesting that even in Hamburg they write on fascism. No more fascism, because that's their point of view. We are the heroes. We are fighting together with the Soviet Union. We are on the better side of the war, of the world, of the humanity. That's just for. I'm sorry, just a thing to assemble to your presentation was kind of great. I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Of course, the memory in the east of Germany is very different from that of the west. I concentrated on Hamburg, but I imagine Memories are slightly different all across, Dresden, for example. Yes.
Well, thank you for your presentation. I would like you to explain a bit more the discussions and the issues that publicly appear before the opening of the memorial in London that you show us for the aircraft men. If I'm not wrong, even the Dresden mayor visited London before the opening and publicly asked not to be unveiled or something like this. Can you please explain?
Okay. There was a lot of. I was going to say there was a lot of controversy, but actually, what surprised me was the lack of controversy there was in Britain about this. In the run up to the opening of this memorial, in the sort of the 5 years or so before it was built and inaugurated, there was a campaign by British newspapers to create a memorial for our bomber boys, because there was this idea that they had been, remembered badly by history, that they were the heroes who were never recognized, because the ideas behind bombing are dodgy, to say the least. Particularly left-wing people were remembering them in a bad way. So the right-wing press were trying to put across this idea of British airmen being kind of like the victims, really, that needed to be taken out of their victimhood and celebrated as heroes. I mean, it was quite ridiculous, really, because it was the case in the 1970s that the bomber forces were remembered in this sort of way as like perpetrators of an evil. But during the 1980s and 90s, they were kind of rehabilitated, and in Britain we realised that it was a normal, it was part of the war. They weren't doing it for sort of bad reasons. They were doing it because it was necessary, but it was ugly and horrible. It's a complicated thing. So it became much more nuanced idea in the 1990s. But then, the newspapers like the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph sort of stirred up this idea of victimhood and, we're not remembering our heroes properly. I don't really understand why. Other people around Europe, especially in Germany, reacted badly to this, as you can imagine. Hang on a sec, who are really the victims here? And what made it particularly irksome for people in Germany especially, but also all around Europe, is that this was 2012 when this monument was opened. So this is the year of the Olympics. The whole of the world is coming to London in a celebration of international sport and so on. And here is the British remembering, we will remember our dead, but we're not going to remember any of yours. It's quite a sort of insular thing, which, we've seen this insularity of Britain expand towards Brexit and so on over the years. I mean, that's probably a very long, rambling answer to your comment, but it was controversial elsewhere and should have been controversial in Britain, but kind of wasn't for some reason.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. Something else that we in Britain like to forget is that this bombing war, we had practiced it in the empire. Italy as well had practiced bombing in the empire, and in Ethiopia, and through the 1920s and 30s, Britain and other countries learned punishment bombing as a strategy. If there was an uprising in somewhere in the empire, in Iraq, in Africa, you bomb villages as punishment, and it works. And this was never controversial at the time. There was no international outcry. And after the Second World War, Britain returned bombing empire. Malaya, Kenya, area bombing, uncontroversial again. It is only controversial when it's white people under the bombs, arguably. So there is many layers of this heritage and these arguments, and it's very interesting. So thank you again for your talk.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. During the 1930s especially, bombing was seen as a cheap way of policing the empire. Rather than sending whole armies there to, and police forces to keep down any disturbances, all you need is 1 or 2 planes to drop bombs on people and the protests stop. So it was a cost-cutting measure as much as anything else. Produce terror and stop any uprisings. It's quite brutal.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And I have a big question. I don't know, big or small. Thinking very much about everything you said about the war everywhere, is almost you are giving the principal thing that everywhere they say, just forget it. It's like no one wants to talk about that. After maybe 1 century, like now, here, no, in Barcelona, and everywhere is the same. Forget it. It's like no one wants to talk about this situation, the real history, what is happening. It's like no communicate with the people who made the war. Why? No, that is terrible, because no one knows exactly what is happening everywhere in the world. I mean, that not talk about this with these people because they are the opposite. I think better to just to know what is happening, because as you say at the opening of your talk, new technology is killing the old technology, and we are in that war everywhere. Everywhere, no one talking, everyone is with their chats, everyone doing their own ideas about what is happening. No one is looking what is happening around. And what do you think about?
Well, I thank you. I agree that nobody wants to feel uncomfortable. So just ignore it. And it's not only the discomfort; it's painful as well. The people who've suffered, they don't want to remember often either. I think it's not surprising that. All the memorials, the major memorials to things like the Holocaust and so on, they weren't immediately after the war. They came later in the sort of 70s and 80s. There was a boom of memory of these things. 30, 40 years later, it's only after time has elapsed that we allow ourselves to stop and think back to what's happened, both as victims and also as perpetrators, or even heroes like to celebrate themselves. Straight after the war, there's monuments to heroes everywhere. The monuments to more shameful things, more difficult things, don't start to appear until much later. So with the terrible things which happen today, I think the same thing will happen. It will be there in the back of our minds. We all know it, but we don't necessarily talk about it, remember it, concretize it in things like monuments and so on.
Well, thank you, Kit. We are closing here. We have coffee time now. Thank you for your speech, and welcome again, soon in Barcelona. Next May, I think. Yeah. Thank you.